screen. And let's see, share this.
Everybody will mute themselves.
Yes, everybody please mute yourselves. And let's go ahead and get started. So this week, we are turning our attention to what I call literary lodgings. And specifically, we're going to be looking at three different houses. We're going to look at the home of Dr. Samuel Johnson. We're going to look at Charles Dickens, one of Charles Dickens's homes. He had many. And also the home of Thomas Carlyle. So to get us going, we're going to start with Samuel Johnson. And this is the house we're going to be talking about. Again, he also had more than one home, but this is the one we're concentrating on. This is at 17 Gough Square in the city of London. And I think do I have a map for you, or did I get rid of? Yeah, there's the map. So you can see where it is here. It's just off of Fleet Street, near the Inner Temple Library. So that's where we're going today. So Samuel Johnson was I'm sure many of you know his name. He was a renowned playwright. He was a biographer. He was a poet, an essayist. And he worked on the Oxford Dictionary of, the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography dubbed him arguably the most distinguished man of letters in English history. And we'll get to that when we get to the dictionary that he himself worked on. But a very important figure, obviously, in history. So here is the man himself. And he was the son of a bookseller. He was born in Staffordshire in the English Midlands, and he was sickly from an early age. He contracted tuberculosis of the lymphatic glands, otherwise known at that time as scrofula. And for many centuries, it was believed that the touch of a king or a queen would cure an individual suffering from this disease. They also called the disease the king's evil. And they would have these ceremonies in which British monarchs touched sufferers. This went all the way back to the time of Edward the Confessor. Edward the Confessor reigned from 1042 to 1066. And it carried on all the way up through the reign of Queen Anne, and she was on the throne from 1702 to 1714. The reason I'm mentioning this is because Johnson suffered from this. He was taken to London when he was 2.5 years old. Now, again, he was in the Midlands, so this was a long journey. It was 3 days. He stayed several nights in London. Now, by the time we got to the 16th century, touching involved hanging a gold coin around the neck of a sufferer. It was usually, on the coin, there was usually an angel on there. And the denomination introduced in 1464 was named after the Archangel Saint Michael. After production of the coin had ceased in the mid-17th century, small medals of a similar design were produced specifically for these ceremonies. And the inscription that appears around the saint on these pieces translates as "To God alone the glory." So basically what they're saying is really God is the ultimate source of the cure. And what you see here on this screen, this is a gold touch piece. You can see the front and the back of it. Johnson was presented this by Queen Anne as a very young child when his parents brought him down to London to be cured. And he kept this for the rest of his life. So that's his touch piece. And today it's housed in the British Museum. Now, after his visit to London, Johnson had various medical treatments that left him with disfiguring scars on his face and his neck. He was also nearly blind in one eye. But despite these maladies, he grew up to be tall, strong, very vigorous, very athletic. He liked to ride, walk, swim. Even in later life, he carried on all those activities. And one account that points to his physical strength and perhaps his temper, which he was also well known for, was when he was said to have thrown a theater goer together with the theater goer's seat off the stage. So at that time, often you would be sitting, you could have some theater goers actually sitting on the stage. And this theater goer was not behaving well in Johnson's opinion, and he literally picked up the seat with the person in it and tossed him off of it. So he was obviously, he was very strong, and obviously he had a strong temper as well. In 1728, Johnson began attending Oxford University, but he only stayed for a little over a year, about 13 months, because he lacked the funds to continue. And after leaving, he took a position as a teacher. And a few years later, he married this woman you see here, Elizabeth Porter. She was a widow, 20 years his senior. He found her very attractive and intelligent, and their marriage was said to have been a true love match. Elizabeth's marriage settlement enabled Johnson to open a school the following year. So he opened a school, and one of his students was David Garrick. Now, David Garrick would go on to become one of the greatest English actors of his generation, and he also was a lifelong friend of Samuel Johnson's. Unfortunately, Johnson's school failed within months, and both Johnson and Garrick set off to London to seek their fortunes there. So Johnson worked for many years in London. In a lowly paid position, he was writing and editing articles for Gentleman's Magazine. He received some critical success with his early poetry and his biography of the poet Richard Savage, but his big opportunity came in 1746 with a commission to write a dictionary of the English language. And what happened at that time was a group of publishers approached him with this idea about creating an authoritative dictionary of the English language. A contract was signed. Johnson said, oh, I can finish this project in 3 years, but actually it took him 9 years. So he lived in 17 different places in London, kind of like Dickens. I mean, they had a lot of different abodes, but he moved to Gough Square 2 years after he started working on this dictionary because he said he needed more space, he needed more elbow room, and he also wanted to be nearer to his publisher. And by this time, Elizabeth Porter was in ill health. Her health was failing, and he wanted to be someplace where he could accommodate her failing health. So for almost a decade, Johnson's constant work on this project really disrupted his living conditions. He had to employ a number of assistants for the copying and mechanical work. The house was filled with incessant noise and clutter. So poor Elizabeth. And he was always busy, and he kept hundreds of books around him. So it was kind of a lot of chaos going on in this home. So the 2-volume dictionary was finally published in 1755. As I said, it took almost 9 years, about 9 years to complete, but he was very proud of the fact that it took him less than a decade because the Académie Française, they had 40 scholars working on their dictionary, and it took them 40 years to complete. So Johnson was very proud of the fact that even though it took him longer than he anticipated, it didn't take them nearly as long as it took the French to do theirs. Now, he's very famous for this, but his dictionary was not the first. Johnson's was not the first, but there was none on the scale of Johnson's. In addition to giving etymologies and definitions, Johnson illustrated usage with quotations drawn almost entirely from writings from the mid-1500s to his own time, and that made his dictionary unique. That said, there were critics of Johnson's work, including Thomas Babington Macaulay, who described Johnson as a wretched, I always say this wrong, etymologist, not entomologist, etymologist. However, it was a monumental piece of scholarship, and it really was, considering what he did, it really was created in an impressively short period of time. In fact, it was the most commonly used and imitated dictionary for almost 150 years, from the time of its first publication to the completion of the Oxford English Dictionary in 1928. Johnson's dictionary offers insights into the 18th century, and it's they say it's a faithful record of the language that people use. So it's more than just a reference work. It's a piece of literature, it's a piece of history. So really it is quite a monumental work. The manuscript itself is long gone, although some fragments remain. One of the original run of the 2,000 copies for the first edition, about half of those are accounted for today. So there are still some hanging around. Many are in private collections, but Dr. Johnson's house has 2 copies and the British Library has 4. So you can see a copy here. Now, the final return on investment for writing the dictionary was relatively little after Johnson paid for his 6 assistants and his own expenses that he incurred. In 1759, 7 years after the death of his wife, he left Gough Square to live in smaller quarters. And that really probably ended the most important decade of his literary career. So he left famous, but really with not all that much money left at the end of the day. But let's talk about the house. That's what we're here to see. Now, admittedly, there's not a lot to see in this house, but several rooms have been interpreted to show what the house might have looked like in his time. And there are a few interesting pieces worth discussing, and also a couple of interesting people who lived with him that I really want to discuss. So let's start with the house itself. The first floor is just like one complete room, basically just kind of a spread out room that you can see, two rooms, but I mean, they're almost, it's kind of an open floor plan, if you will. And you can see, it's got the period piece furniture, it's got portraits along the wall. And this is a room that has a lot of different portraits and things up on the walls. But I want to point this out. I mentioned David Garrick, who was a very famous actor of his time. And since I'm a theater nerd, this interested me. This is a wooden trunk that once belonged to David Garrick. So this is going all the way back to Johnson's friendship with Garrick, and this ended up in Johnson's house. Probably they acquired it. I'm not sure how it was acquired. My guess is it was when the house was being interpreted and somehow someone found this chest, and since he was friends with Garrick, that's where it ended up. But it's very interesting to have this piece. And then I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, there's lots of portraits in the house. I want to point out in the parlor, this portrait on the left of a Jamaican man. And we are going to come back and talk about him later, but I wanted to point that out. Now, if we go upstairs, there is a room with a framed copy of Johnson's will that you can look at. And there's a lending library, and the library has Johnson-related works. Visitors are allowed to actually take them out and read them if you want to. And there's also up here is one of the original copies of Johnson's dictionary, and also a facsimile that you can peruse yourself. So you can pick it up and touch it and, look at some of the pages. Now, speaking of lending libraries, like I said, you can take books out of here. Lending Johnson a book was apparently very unwise because he used to scroll his own notes all over the margins. No matter how valuable the book was, even though it wasn't his book, he would just get in there with his pen and start writing all over it. And this is the garret, or the attic, if you will, and this is where Johnson did work on the dictionary. If you go up there now, they have rotating exhibits going on up there that you can look at. And here's just a sample from the facsimile, just a sample from the dictionary. And you can see how he's defining these words. So for me, what really makes this house interesting are the individuals connected to it beyond Johnson and his wife. So I want to take a look at a couple of those because they're really fascinating. So during his 17 years at Gough Square, the household was not exclusively limited to Johnson and his wife. This woman here, Anna Williams, she was a Welsh poet and a close companion of the couple. She was the daughter of a scientist and a physician named Zachariah Williams, and her father, unusually for the time, provided her with a very extensive artistic and scientific education. When Anna was about 20 years old, her family moved into the Charter House in London. If you have taken my History of London course, that name might sound familiar. That was an almshouse for the poor at the time. Her father became bedridden after being hospitalized in 1745. And a few years later, he was actually thrown out of the hospital. So he appealed to Johnson, whom he knew, and Johnson had taken a very strong interest in William's experiments. And he also helped him publish his theory of longitude. So he went to Johnson and said, we need help. And Johnson agreed to help. Cataracts left Anna Williams either blind or very visually impaired in the 1740s. And shortly before before Samuel Johnson's wife died in 1752, Anna became her close companion, and she was having trouble with her eyesight. Her father obviously was friends with Johnson, so she became close companions of Johnson's wife. And it was around this time that Samuel Johnson arranged for Anna to have surgery for the cataracts that had pretty much left her blind. Unfortunately, the operation failed, but Johnson helped to support Anna, and she became a member of his household. And from that date, she lived with Johnson in his various residences, except for a period of, I think, about 6 years between 1759 and 1765, because at that time Johnson had left Gough Square and he moved into Intertemple, so she couldn't move in with him there. And so she took up residence nearby, though, at Bolt Court. And it was said that Johnson every night would go over to Bolt Court from Intertemple and have tea with her every night. No matter how late it was, he'd go sit with her and have tea. So as I said, there was a period of a few years where Anna wasn't there, but in 1765, she once again became a member of his household, and she lived there until her death in 1783. She had her own apartment in Johnson's houses, and her role was to actually supervise household management and expenses. Now, as she grew older and frailer, she became more and more intolerant toward other members of the household. This did not affect Johnson's care for her. He wrote a prayer for her in her last illness. And after her death, he wrote, "Her curiosity was universal, her knowledge was very extensive, and she sustained 40 years of misery with steady fortitude. 30 years and more she has been my companion, and her death has left me very desolate." So he was very, very fond of her, even though not everybody else in the household was very fond of her. Besides poetry, she wrote an unfinished dictionary of her own, a dictionary of philosophical terms, and she translated and published a French biography of the Emperor Julian. So she was quite an interesting woman, and so her connection to the house is quite interesting. Now, another close companion of Johnson's was his servant and his heir, Francis Barber. This is the man I showed you earlier in the parlor, the portrait in the parlor. We think it's him. They never did totally say if it was him or not, but that's what they think. A former slave, Barber spent his early years on a Jamaican sugar plantation, and this plantation was owned by Johnson's close friend, Colonel Richard Bathurst. Now, at the age of 8 years old, Barber was brought to England by Bathurst, and Bathurst had him baptized, and he gave him his English name of Francis Barber. After Johnson's wife died and he was grieving, really grieving and missing his wife, Francis is given to Johnson. He's kind of handed over to Johnson. Johnson views him as a household servant, but also kind of a son of sorts. He sends him to be educated, and he's really upset that when Francis Barber gains his freedom from Bathurst as a teenager, Barber decides he wants to move out of the Johnson household. He ends up being an apprentice at an apothecary, and he ended up after that, he joined the Royal Navy during the 7 Years' War. Now, he eventually returns to Johnson, and he was with Johnson at the time of his death. Johnson, in effect, names Francis Barber as his heir, and he leaves him what was for Barber a great deal of money. As I said, Johnson wasn't super rich, but I mean, he did leave him pretty much everything he had. Unfortunately, Barber went through it very quickly. He was paying for medical bills because his own health wasn't great, education for his children. By this time, he had married, and Barber himself, kind of like Johnson before him, established a school, but again, a very short-lived school. It wasn't all that successful. So Francis Barber is fascinating. I think I put in your readings a biography of him, if I'm not mistaken. If I didn't, let me know, and I'll share one with you. Very interesting individual, and very interesting that Samuel Johnson took so strongly to him and tried to help him. Okay, so Johnson gained a pension from George III in 1762, and this allowed him a more comfortable lifestyle than he had had previously, hence his ability to share money with Francis Barber. So he could now spend more time traveling and talking. He was well known for his very robust character and challenging and often hilarious conversation, they said. He was very sociable. He was a member of several clubs, and his circle of friends included the painter Sir Joshua Reynolds, the writer Oliver Goldsmith, and his great good friend, the Scottish lawyer James Boswell, who we see here. This was really one of literary history's most famous friendships. They met by chance, the two of them, in a London bookshop, and the first impressions were not favorable. Johnson, who famously disliked the Scots for whatever reason, he discovered Boswell's Edinburgh origins, and he wasn't pleased about that. He didn't like the Scots. And for his part, Boswell described Johnson as, in quotes, a man of most dreadful appearance. He is very slovenly in dress and speaks with a most uncouth voice. So the two of them did not hit it off initially, but despite this kind of shaky start, they became very close friends. In 1773, they embarked on a 3-month tour across the Highlands and the Western Islands of Scotland. So I guess Boswell must have persuaded Johnson that the Scots weren't all that bad. Boswell began to record Johnson's character during this time, and his observations formed the basis of his later biography, a really fantastic biography of Johnson, The Life of Samuel Johnson. It was published in 1791, 6 years after Johnson's death, filled with very colorful anecdotes, and it really does capture Johnson's vivacity and his idiosyncrasies. It's really widely considered to be one of the most famous biographies in the English language, period, never mind just of Johnson. And his work has remained popular ever since. It's in print to this day. It's still in print. So again, we get a lot of our insights about Johnson, and including his relationship with Samuel Barber, by the way. Samuel Barber shows up in Boswell's biography of Johnson. We get a lot of our insights from Boswell and Boswell's friendship with Johnson. So again, you can, Google it. There's all kinds of editions out there that are still in print. One of the anecdotes related by James Boswell, which I love, centers on Hodge, a black cat whom Johnson was very, very fond of. This is a statue of Hodge just outside the house that Johnson lived in Gough Square. Boswell writes of Johnson regularly purchasing oysters to feed Hodge. And Johnson even went out and bought the oysters himself, so he would not annoy his servants by his frequent shopping trips for the cat. And you can see here on the right, there are oyster shells on this little statue of Hodge. Writing in his Life of Samuel Johnson, Boswell recalls, I never shall forget the indulgence with which he treated Hodge. I recollect him one day scrambling up Dr. Johnson's breast, apparently with much satisfaction, while my friend, smiling and half whistling, rubbed down his back and pulled him by the tail. And when I observed he was a fine cat, saying, why, yes, but I have had cats whom I liked better than this one. So this is what Boswell said. And then Hodge, as if almost perceiving this insult, if you will, looked at him and he went on to say, but he's a very fine cat indeed. So that's Hodge, and Hodge has he's sitting on the dictionary, on Johnson's dictionary, and he's got his oyster shells with him. This was made by a sculptor named John Bickley, and it was installed in 1997, so it's not that old, outside of Johnson's house. Although, ironically, Hodge never actually lived in this house. He never lived here. And he's shown, as I said, sitting on Johnson's dictionary next to some of these empty oyster shells. And there's an inscription on the monument that says, a very fine cat indeed. So after Johnson left the house in 1759, it was leased to a succession of tenants. It was a hotel for a while. It was a B&B. It was used as a printer's studio. It was threatened with demolition in 1911, and that's when a member of parliament named Cecil Harmsworth, he stepped in and he said, no, we can't have this demolished. We have to preserve this. And he restored the property. During the Second World War, the house was a social club for the auxiliary fire service. It was hit several times by bombs, and in the garret where Johnson wrote his dictionary that we looked at, that attic space, That was badly damaged, but the house survived, obviously. It was restored. And if aside from anything else, it really is an excellent example of an early Georgian townhouse. So again, not really big, not fancy, but very interesting, and a lot of interesting stories that are wrapped around the house and the characters of the people here. And just a stone's throw away is the old Cheshire Cheese Pub. Johnson knew this place well. He frequented it. He was there all the time. I like this pub myself. It's got little rooms and warrens all over the place, upstairs and downstairs. And you can see it burned in the fire of 1666, but it was rebuilt in 1667. And outside the pub, they've got this whole long list of here were all the monarchs. And now they'll have to add King Charles's name there, I guess, because the pub is still going. So according to the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations, today Johnson is the second most quoted Englishman. And of course, he is very famous, we're talking about London here. When a man is tired of London, he is tired of life, for there is in London all that life can afford. So that's Samuel Johnson. Now let's move on to Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens, this is his museum and house. This is actually a very interesting place. It's on Doughty Street. It's his only surviving London home. In 1837, a year after marrying and shortly after the birth of his first child, the 25-year-old Dickens and his wife Catherine moved into Doughty Street as their very first home. And they resided here for nearly 3 years. And it was here that Dickens wrote Oliver Twist, Pickwick Papers, and Nicholas Nickleby. And it's also where his second and third children were born. So you can see the general area that it's in here. And you can see right up here, I have a course on museums, and we talk about the Foundling Museum, which is also a fascinating place to visit. But you can kind of see on the map where Dickens' house is, not too far from Russell Square. So again, I'm sure all of you know who Charles Dickens was, and some of you may even be familiar with his background, so I'll keep this introduction to him kind of short. He was born in what is now Portsmouth in 1812, and his early years were very happy and comfortable, but that changed when the family moved to London in 1822. Dickens' father was notoriously bad at managing his finances, and he acquired so much debt. The entire family, except for Charles and his older sister Fanny, were sent to debtor's prison. Now, the father was the only one sent to debtor's prison, but at that time, since the male of the household was usually the breadwinner, often whole families would move into these debtor's prisons because they could not afford to. They couldn't pay the rent, they couldn't feed themselves, so whole families would move in, and that's why Dickens' family was there. At the age of 12 years old, Dickens had to drop out of school, and he worked in a blacking warehouse along the River Thames. He earned a very meager salary, basically pasting labels onto blacking pots for shoe polish. That was his job. And there's the man. Now, he returned to school for a while, and then he found work, first as a clerk in a legal firm, and later as a parliamentary reporter. And that's really where his writing career began. And in 1836, he married Catherine Hogarth. She was the daughter of his editor at the newspaper for which he worked, and they went on to have 10 children. Over the years, his fame grew as the author of many classics, including David Copperfield, A Christmas Carol, Great Expectations. I'm sure all of you know these titles. And his fame meant that he was constantly in the public eye. And in addition to socializing with the most famous writers, actors, artists, politicians of his day, he really had quite a large social circle. He was also one of the country's greatest charitable fundraisers and a very outspoken advocate for social reform in public health and sanitation. He spoke out about poverty, education, workers' rights, even the plight of prostitutes. So he had a very strong social conscience. Now, the early years of Dickens' marriage were said to be happy ones, but it could be argued that Charles may not have been the best of husbands. And I'm not going to get into this because this is not a whole lecture about Charles Dickens, but he doesn't have a great reputation for how he treated Catherine, his wife. He was said to have had a very strong attraction to, and some even say obsession, with his wife's younger sister, Mary Hogarth, who you see here. She moved in with the family when they rented the Doughty Street residence, but she died unexpectedly only weeks later of heart failure. You can see her bedroom, and you can see this portrait in her bedroom in the house. It was said that Dickens' obsession was so strong with her that he expressed a desire to be buried alongside her. She was 17 years old at the time. And he said, I want to be buried alongside my 17-year-old sister-in-law. And he was very upset, apparently very upset, when one of Mary's brothers was buried alongside her instead. So it robbed Dickens of the spot where he wanted to be buried. Scholars have argued over whether or not Catherine Dickens was mentally ill. And the evidence of that at one point is Dickens wanted to have his wife committed to an insane asylum. He moved out of their bedroom. He had the connecting door between two rooms boarded shut, and then he formally separated from her, announcing in a newspaper advertisement in June of 1858 that, in quotes, some domestic trouble of mine of long standing has been resolved. I mean, can you imagine putting this in the newspaper? So I haven't read a lot about his wife, but my understanding is she was not well served by her husband, shall we say. She never made any public complaint about her husband's treatment of her. And in reality, the separation was due in part to his relationship, Dickens' relationship with a young actress who we see here, Ellen Ternan. Now, Dickens died in 1870 at the age of 58. His wish was really, since he couldn't be buried next to his sister-in-law, his wish was to be buried in a simple grave in the cemetery of Rochester Cathedral in Kent. And his will stipulated that he wanted no public announcement made concerning the time or place of his death. Well, despite his wishes, he was buried in Poets' Corner at Westminster Abbey, a very public place. And while the funeral itself was private, hundreds of thousands of people were said to have lined up to walk past his open grave for 3 days following the funeral. And there is the stone over his grave. All right, let's go into the house now that we've talked about him a little bit. This was a terrace house. It was built between 1805 and 1809. This was during a time of really rapid urban growth in London. This area was once all open land, but it was considered a really now, safe, respectable part of Bloomsbury. It was described by the journalist Edmund Yates, who was a contemporary of Dickens. He described the house as a pleasant 12-room dwelling of pink brick with 3 stories and an attic, a white arched entrance door at the street level, and a small private garden in the rear. It was located just north of Gray's Inn, a genteel, again in quotes, a genteel private street with a lodge at each end and gates that were closed at night by a porter in a gold-laced hat and a mulberry-colored coat. So you could argue that it was a gated community. Indeed, it was. Now, the streets at this time would have been very lively, very noisy, a not uncommon phenomenon in a city that was growing so rapidly. Again, if you did the history of London class, we talked about this boom in population and growth at this time period in London. So there would have been, I think there were like 9, 10 churches nearby. So you would have had church bells ringing on Sunday mornings. You would have had horses and carts going up and down the cobblestone streets making noise. Street vendors would be out here. Remember, those gates were only closed at night, so everybody could wander through during the day. And street musicians. There were a lot of street musicians around at this time. In fact, the latter, the street musicians, proved to be so troublesome, Dickens and others launched an anti-noise campaign. And this resulted in the Street Music Act of 1864. So Dickens was bothered by this noise. And as we're going to see when we discuss Thomas Carlyle's house, Dickens wasn't the only one plagued by bothersome street noise. So the house had a fresh supply of water pumped directly into it. And that was a recent innovation in London that was not available to everybody. But it was not without its problems. The house was not without its problems. When Dickens moved out in 1839, he complained to the landlord that the drains had been a serious annoyance to us. And although we have had the plumbers in the house half a dozen times, they've not been able to make their work last. After the last time they were here, basically, he said, we received strong notice of their being in the neighborhood, whatever that means. So he wasn't, they did have some problems with the house, obviously. Now, when Charles and Catherine Dickens, along with their young son, first moved into this house, they had a 3-year lease. It was £80 a year. Previously, they had lived in chambers at Furnival's Inn. So this was really spacious, 12 rooms. They had a lot of room to move around, not only for his growing family, but also for domestic servants. So this was a real step up in their eyes. So here is the dining room, sort of laid out for Christmas. This is the first room you enter off the entrance hall. And Dickens and his wife loved to throw extravagant parties here. Sometimes they entertained up to 14 people for dinner. This room's not that large, so those dinners must have been pretty cozy. People must have been really shoved up against each other. And over the fireplace, you can see a portrait of Dickens. And another shot of the room here, the dining room, includes the mahogany sideboard that Dickens bought for the house. When he moved in, he bought a great deal of furnishings for his new residence. He had very particular tastes and apparently took great pleasure in decorating his homes. He really went to town on these things. And the bust that you saw here, over here, I'm giving you a close-up of here. This is a copy of a marble bust of Dickens, and this was sculpted by an American artist named Henry Dexter in 1842 when Dickens was visiting the US. Now, Dickens would have been around 30 years of age at that time, so it gives us a good indication what he might have looked like when he was living in Doughty Street. Here is the morning room. These were kind of like sitting rooms where the family would spend the morning, hence the title. Now, we assume it would have been Catherine who spent most of her time in this room while her husband was working in his study upstairs. And she would sit here, she would write letters, she would meet with visitors, maybe give the domestic staff their orders for the day. There are portraits in this room, as you can see, of Catherine and Charles over the fireplace, and also of their children. You can't see those as well further on, but of their children, including one of their daughter, Katie, who you see here on the right. This is one of the paintings. Katie was painted by her second husband, an Italian artist named Carlo Perugini. And it should be noted that Katie herself went on to be an accomplished artist. She was renowned as a portrait painter, and she exhibited regularly at the Royal Academy, and again, quite a feat for a woman that age, or a woman of that time even. All right, the drawing room. This is the largest room in the house. It's where Charles and Catherine Dickens would have entertained their guests after dinner. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Dickens was very, very, very particular about his home furnishings and his decorations. He made various changes to the property, particularly the drawing room here. He removed the then unfashionable decorative rail, kind of a waist-high rail that went around the room. He took that out. He hung wallpaper, he installed a fitted carpet, and even put in a marble hearth stone by the fireplace here. So it's amazing when you're just renting a place to spend this much money making renovations. The red leather chair you see here on the right is a piece of furniture that Dickens bought for the room. And then if we go upstairs, we can look at the bedrooms here. You've got Mary Hogarth's on the left. I'm sorry, you got Mary Hogarth's here, and you can see this was her bedroom, and then Dickens' bedroom. And then the study. So Dickens was able to afford the rent for this house by keeping an extremely busy schedule of writing and editing in this study that you see here. He was enormously productive when he was living here, focusing on fiction. And he had a very interesting, I'd say interesting approach to writing. So his novels started out being serialized monthly. And that was the case of the Pickwick Papers. It was serialized monthly, but others were serialized weekly. Oliver Twist was serialized weekly. So basically what Dickens did between February 1837 and May of 1838 was he spent the first 2 weeks of each month devoted to writing Oliver Twist, and the next 2 weeks to writing the Pickwick Papers. And once the latter was finished, he spent the first 2 weeks of, then he'd move on to Nicholas Nickleby and the second 2 weeks on Oliver Twist. So he had a very interesting approach to how he wrote. He parceled them out because of these serializations. The very famous desk you see here in the study is actually from his final home, Gad's Hill in Kent. So really, he did not write at this desk in Doughty Street. This is where Dickens sat to write Great Expectations, Our Mutual Friend, and The Mystery of Edwin Drood. The desk and chair were bought by the museum in 2015, thanks to a grant from the National Heritage Memorial Fund. Now, originally, the furniture had been passed down throughout the Dickens family after he died in 1870, but a lot of furniture was auctioned off in 2004, and since then, the furniture has been in private ownership until it was purchased by the museum. So this desk was finally purchased by the museum. The top floor of the house was dedicated to rooms for children and servants. And in the museum, as I said, it's the house, but it's also kind of a museum. This room is dedicated to various events in Dickens' childhood. So what you see here, interestingly enough, is a prison grill from the Marshalsea prison. This was the debtor prison in Southwark, where Dickens' father was. So it really does represent the most influential and painful experience in young Charles Dickens's life. And then if we go downstairs, you can see that the kitchen it's furnished with period pieces that would have been found in an early Victorian kitchen. Now, with an increase in Dickens' social status, a well-equipped, sizable kitchen would have really been necessary because, as I said, he liked to give a lot of dinner parties. So they needed a big enough kitchen to prepare and serve the food for these dinner parties, not to mention the day-to-day needs of his own family. This would have been the central hub for all four of the servants who worked and lived in the house, Dickens' house. And adjacent to the kitchen was a washroom, a scullery. A lot of the general housework would be carried out down here. And speaking of kitchens and cooking, in 1851, Catherine Dickens published a book under the pen name of Lady Maria Clutterbuck. I love that pen name. And the book was entitled, What Shall We Have for Dinner? Satisfactorily answered by numerous bills of fare from 2 to 18 persons. And so you can see a copy of the book here that Catherine Dickens wrote. And here are some of the bills of fare for that you could make. They ate quite well. Lamb stewed with peas, potatoes. Looks like some good food to me. Now the garden. The house has a really nice cafe and a garden seating area in the back. So you can go. The cafe is at the back of the house. You can get a pot of tea, you can get a baked good, and then sit out in the garden. It's a lovely garden. And the garden itself has some Dickens memorabilia in it. So to point out one of these, there's a gravestone in the garden. This is the gravestone of Robert Seymour. He was an artist who worked with Dickens. Unfortunately, Seymour committed suicide after he fell out with Dickens. Some of the outstanding illustrators and artists of the day, they were often recruited to provide images for Charles Dickens' novels. And often they would have to produce these illustrations at very short notice for these forthcoming chapters, because remember I told you they were being serialized. Dickens' first writing commission was actually to provide some text for prints by Robert Seymour, interestingly enough. Seymour was only about 38 maybe when he died. But Dickens was actually originally employed to provide text for Seymour's prints. And so he did so for that. Now, why is his gravestone here? Well, the gravestone went missing for more than 100 years, and it was found in a crypt in a London church. And it was rededicated in Dickens' garden, just to point out his relationship with Seymour. Some people blamed Dickens for Seymour's suicide, but it's also believed that Seymour suffered from mental health issues for many, many years prior to his suicide. But it's interesting to see the gravestone and actually read the plaque about his relationship with Dickens and what he did. The scholar Stephen Jarvis, who was the one that found the gravestone, he was actually working on a biography of Seymour at the time. He wrote a novel about Dickens and Seymour entitled Death and Mr. Pickwick. I have not read it, so I can't recommend it or not recommend it. But he spent 5 years, this scholar did, trying to get permission to move that stone to Doughty Street, because he thought it would honor Seymour and he thought it would right a historical wrong. The museum eventually accepted the stone as an important addition to their collection, but they also made it very clear that they don't believe Dickens had anything to do with the artist's death. He was not responsible for it at all. And here you can see some of these etchings. Mr. Pickwick addresses the club, and the pugnacious cabman. As I said, it's a lovely place to sit and have some tea. It's London, so it's filled with pigeons. And this wasn't our table, but it was a table over from ours. And the pigeon, it was a funny picture. I thought I had to snap it because it looked like the pigeon was sitting down to finish his tea, if you will. Now, the last thing I wanted to point out was the keystone. There's a keystone in the garden, but this was actually over the front door of Dickens' next home at 1 Devonshire Terrace. But which you can kind of see here on the right, and there is the keystone that now sits in the garden on Doughty Street. Okay, so to point out a couple more things about Dickens, as I said, the house we just looked at was the only surviving house of Dickens, but he did have other houses in London. At the former site of his house on Devonshire Terrace that we just looked at, that picture, now Marylebone Road, he lived there from 1839 to 51. It had a very impressive portico of brick and stone. The house had 2 semicircular bow windows, rising the whole height of the house. And within a large vestibule area, when you walked in, it opened to a very spacious square hall, a stairway curving up to the left, a library on the right, stairs that went down into a garden area, a dining room with ornamental columns, and a coach house in the rear. Upstairs, there was a drawing room, there were bedrooms, there was a nursery. So as you can imagine, by this time, Dickens had really stepped up in the world, a much different home than he had on Doughty Street. Unfortunately, that home, as I said, no longer survives. Now there's a very nondescript office block that was built in the 1950s. It's really ugly, but they do have this mural on the side. And this depicts characters from Dickens novels. You can see Dickens here, and then characters from David Copperfield, A Christmas Carol, The Old Curiosity Shop, Barnaby Rudge, Martin Chuzzlewit, and Dombey and Son. And these were all things that Dickens wrote, novels that Dickens wrote when he was living at Devonshire Terrace. And then Tavistock Square in Bloomsbury, this is where Dickens lived from 1851 to 1860. And while living here, he wrote Bleak House, Hard Times, Little Dorrit, A Tale of Two Cities, and he collaborated with Wilkie Collins on a melodrama called The Frozen Deep. And for the initial production of this play and others, excuse me, Dickens actually converted the houses. There was a large schoolroom in this house, and he converted it into the smallest theater in the world, in quotes. And we do have some pictures of the interior of this before it was gone. So you can see here what the interior looked like. And you can see this plaque here. This was for the Tavistock House. And some of the bricks that you see on the right-hand side here, there's an inscription here. These were part of the foundation of the house. It's now within the private garden of the British Medical Association building. And then finally, Dickens' final home, Gad's Hill. In 1857, he really did achieve his boyhood dream. He really wanted to have Gad's Hill in Kent. And it's about the same time, around this time, that he met Ellen Ternan, that actress I mentioned earlier. The following year, he and Catherine separated. And in 1860, he sold Tavistock House and he moved to Kent, where he spent the rest of his life. Here is a photo of the opening of the Charles Dickens house on Doughty Street in 1925, and you can see it was quite the scene here. Lots of people showed up to watch the house being open, people peeking out of their windows in various places. Okay, that's Mr. Dickens. Now, let's move on. We're going to go to Chelsea, my stomping ground, and we're going to talk about Thomas Carlyle's house. So this is in the west part of London. And it's 24 Cheney Row. So In 1834, the Scottish historian and biographer Thomas Carlyle and his wife Jane moved into this house in Chelsea. Like Dickens' house, it was part of a Georgian terrace. But unlike Dickens' central London Bloomsbury location, Chelsea in West London, it's on the northern bank of the Thames, was not considered a desirable location when he moved there, when Carlyle moved there. In the 16th century, it was a very interesting place. Henry VIII had a grand manor in Chelsea, and it encompassed a large part of the present-day Chelsea. And likewise, Tudor nobility, including Henry's one-time Lord Chancellor, Thomas More, he had a manor house in Chelsea. And again, if you did the History of London class, we talked about this a little bit. Now, at that time, Chelsea had kind of been a little village into itself. It wasn't part of London at all. But with the advent of the Industrial Revolution and rapid population growth in London, the city soon spread into Chelsea. And as a result, new housing was built, as well as the Chelsea Bridge and the Albert Bridge. And in addition, the Chelsea Embankment, which was created as a result of the new and badly needed sewer system in London, that was also designed at this time. So the Carlyles rented their terraced house for only £35 a year, which was far, far, far cheaper, obviously, than Charles Dickens' £80 a year. And what's more, they stayed in this house for the rest of their lives, in Thomas's case, for 47 years. So they really stayed here. And their rent never increased the entire time that they were here. So let's talk about Mr. Carlyle. He was, as I said, a Scottish historian, a novelist, a biographer. He was a satirist, an essayist, and a philosopher. He wore many hats. He wrote notable biographies of Oliver Cromwell and Frederick the Great, among others. He was a very prominent figure in Victorian literary society, and his influence as a social commentator and as a historian were absolutely huge. He was also an A-list celebrity, if you will, during his time, and he had quite a devoted following. And he was commonly referred to as the Sage of Chelsea. He was very impacted by German Romanticism and its exploration of nature and the spiritual side of humanity. Carlyle deplored the Industrial Revolution. He believed that the Victorian pursuit of money and self-interest was corrupting human relationships. And although he did enjoy the company of intellectuals, he kind of seems to have disliked the rest of humanity on the whole. And he had a particular hatred of hawkers, street hawkers, and barrel organ grinders. Remember, I told you that those noisy street musicians that Dickens didn't like. This was really a thorn in Carlyle's side. He could not escape. He actually ended up, we'll see later, he shut himself into the most isolated room at the top of the house. The noise really bothered him. So this is something he shared with his contemporary, Charles Dickens. Now, speaking of Dickens, Dickens was one of Carlyle's set, and he was quoted as saying, "I would go further to see Carlyle than any man alive." Dickens used Carlyle's 3-volume work on the French Revolution as his historical basis for his novel, A Tale of Two Cities. So there is a connection between these two. Now, while Thomas Carlyle's social commentary was championed by social reformers at the time, later in life his views seemed to turn quite conservative. He even suggested that slavery had been a force for social good. And this ended up putting him in direct opposition with liberal thinkers of the time, some of whom had been his friends before this, and therefore he very quickly fell out of favor. But he did leave some legacies. One of his strongest legacies in London that survives to this day is the London Library. It was established in 1841 at a time when there were no lending libraries in London. It was also an era where state-funded libraries did not yet exist. And Carlyle was very frustrated by not being able to borrow books in London. So he began gathering support for a lending library, and he created a committee in April of 1840 to oversee the work of raising funds. The library was founded in May of 1841, and Carlyle sat on its first committee and was elected president of the library in 1870. So he did have his legacies, but now let's go inside the house. Again, let's go in and take a look here. Now, when the couple moved into the house in 1834, they'd been married for about 8 years, and they had been living up to this point in rural Scotland for 6 years. Jane had real misgivings about moving so close to the river. It's very close to the Thames. And she said, at that time, the river, as I've talked about in other courses, it was badly polluted. It was very smelly. Um, but she did love the house from the start. The minute she saw the house, she loved it. And she wrote to her mother-in-law, I could not have made myself a better house if I had money at command. My husband will be healthier and happier than he has been in long years. And Carlyle himself described it as a right old strong roomy brick house. The house was built in 1708. It retains many authentic features from the Carlyle's time there, including many pieces of furniture, books, pictures, other artifacts that belonged to the Carlyles, and again have been returned to the house over time. Now, although their fortunes did improve, they never attained great wealth. So they didn't have the domestic luxuries that Dickens had, like running water. They didn't have adequate heating. So he was never on a scale with Dickens in terms of his finances. And Chelsea may not have been the most fashionable location at that time. Now it's an ultra super expensive location. So it wasn't all that fashionable when Carlyle moved there, but it was very bohemian. It had a very bohemian neighborhood with artists, writers, radicals moving in. Many luminaries of the Victorian era lived here. I think of it like what Greenwich Village used to be like before that got all gentrified. In addition to Carlyle, painters such as Turner and Whistler lived here. Many writers lived here, Jonathan Swift, Oscar Wilde. And so, Thomas and Jane Carlyle were in the thick of the action. So as I said, their social circle, besides Charles Dickens, included Alfred Lord Tennyson, Robert Browning, William Makepeace Thackeray, John Ruskin, and even Charles Darwin, to name but a few. So they had quite a social setting here. Here is Jane. She, again, is a very interesting character. She was Scottish. She was the daughter of a doctor. She was privately educated for most of her childhood, and she turned down several suitors before meeting Carlyle. And she was said to have been very attracted by his intelligence and what she called his rural awkwardness. Now, both these individuals, Jane and Thomas, were rather difficult. Their marriage was often very, very stormy, but they were very devoted to one another. And in an essay entitled Great Men's Houses, Virginia Woolf describes Thomas and Jane's home as, in quotes, not so much a dwelling place as a battlefield. And she added that the hours spent here will tell us more about them than we can learn from all the biographies. Jane's letters were published after her death, and they revealed a marriage that, at least for her, felt at times poisonous. As Charles Drinkwater put it in the Outline of Literature, Carlyle was a hard man to live with. His wife was gently bred. He remained a peasant. He was the son of a stonemason. He was ill-tempered, given to grumbling and nagging. There are probably few women less to be envied than the wives of literary geniuses. That said, Jane could give as good as she got. So now, she was never published in her lifetime, but again, she was very well known for her letters, and they make fascinating and often rather humorous reading. Virginia Woolf actually called her one of the great letter writers of her time. Jane suffered ill health most of her life, and she died quite suddenly in 1866, either of a heart attack or a stroke. Her letters and comments by her contemporaries paint a picture of a highly intelligent, demanding woman with a strong personality and a really sharp wit. So despite their complicated relationships, they held each other in very high esteem, again, as you can see from their letters to one another. And writing of Jane after her death, Thomas said, she could do anything well to which she chose to give herself. She had a clear, keen, incisive faculty of seeing through things and hating all that was make-believe or pretentious. She had good sense that amounted to genius. She loved to learn. She was cultivated in all her faculties to the utmost of her power. She was always witty. In a word, she was fascinating, and everyone fell in love with her. And he also expressed remorse for his neglect of Jane. So if you really want a first-hand account of what life was like in this house, her letters, as I said, they're very illuminating and also quite humorous. So I mentioned that the Carlyles were never affluent. They only had one live-in servant, and Jane was apparently a very difficult employer, She went through 34 servants in 32 years. So the poor solitary servant who worked for the Carlyles had to be a maid of all works. She cooked, served meals, washed dishes, sewed, cleaned the house, pumped and carried water up steep stairs. You remember they didn't have water coming into their home, and into the bedrooms. She had to carry the water up. The half dozen fireplaces in this house meant a constant cleaning of grates, as well as building and tending of fires and keeping a steady supply of coals on hand. The servant only made 12 pounds a year, and she had to sleep on a cot in the kitchen. And even that was complicated by the fact that Carlyle would often have an evening smoke in the kitchen. So that meant the poor maid could not retire for the night until Carlyle had come down, smoked his cigar or cigarette, and then left. Jane often fought with her servants. She was quite demanding. One maid was dismissed for being found mortal drunk, in quotes, and another actually gave birth to an illegitimate child in the china closet. The maid, her name was Mary, somehow she was able to give birth while Carlyle was entertaining in the room next door. I don't know how she kept it so quiet. After the delivery, she smuggled the baby out of the house without Carlyle even knowing about it. There were some servants that met with with Jane Carlyle's approval, including one of whom Jane wrote about, and she said, Elizabeth Sprague is far the most lovable servant I have ever had. My only fear is that being only 24 and calculated to produce an impression on the other sex, she may weary of single services. As we learn from her letters, there were times when the Carlyles were between servants, and Jane herself had to shoulder the burden without any help, so she would be doing all this work. And even when there was a maid, Jane often shared in the hard physical labor to keep the household going. This is not from their home, I don't believe, but this is just I found this, I can't even remember where I found this now, but I thought it was very interesting with this servant kind of looking out the window. It's kind of ghostly. So the kitchen, here's the kitchen. As I said, the technology was primitive. There was no running water. There was a hand pump that actually continued to be used even after water lines were run into the house in 1852. And it was only after that time that gas lighting and a new stove were installed as well. So pretty primitive. And you can see the maid's bed here. The food cooked in this kitchen was very, very bland, unlike the Dickens big parties, because both Jane and Thomas had very delicate digestive systems. So we're told that grilled lamb, boiled potatoes, and chicken broth were among their favorite foods. And as food attracted pests, mice and black beetles were particularly troublesome in the Carlyles' house, and they ended up bringing in cats to kind of hunt down the mice. Here's the parlor. I love this room because you'll see in a minute, this room has changed very, very little since the day of the Carlyles, this parlor has. And how do we know that? From the following paintings. So take a look at this room for a minute. Try to memorize what you're seeing here. And here's a painting that was done. It's on display in the house. It's entitled A Chelsea Interior. And then in parentheses, the Carlyles at home with their dog Nero, Great Cheney Row, London. Thomas is wearing one of his favorite striped silk dressing gowns, and he's holding onto an old-fashioned long-stemmed pipe. The armchair in which Jane is sitting is still there. Now, given their prickly personalities, the Carlyles were not patient models, no surprise for people painting them. Jane wrote to a friend complaining about how tiresome it was to have the artist endlessly hovering about, sketching and painting, and she also complained about the finished product. She said, I wish Tate had not painted Nero as big as a sheep. There's Nero over there, and Nero hardly looks like a sheep, but okay. This provokes me more than being transported to posterity in the wrong perspective and with a frightful table cover. So as I said, Jane was very outspoken. But again, if we go back, so you can see the mirror, you can see the tiles inside the fireplace. And if we go back, almost exactly the same. It's very, very similar today. So speaking of Nero, here are Jane and Nero. Nero was a much loved pet. Carlyle would feed Nero raisins and take Nero on late night walks through Chelsea. And Nero features quite prominently in Jane Carlyle's letters, if you read them. At one point later in life, when he was older and suffering from asthma, this poor little dog had asthma, Jane made him a flannel coat. And when poor little Nero died, Both Jane and Thomas grieved. He's buried in the back garden. He did have a headstone at one time. Unfortunately, it has disappeared now. But he was much loved by the Carlyles. This is their drawing room, you can see here. It started life as Thomas Carlyle's library and study, and it was here that he wrote the French Revolution, and that really did make him a household name in intellectual circles. He was eventually driven out of this room as a study because of the outdoor noise I was talking about, and he ended up going up to the attic. He created this study, we'll look at it a little more in a minute, up in the attic. But speaking of Carlyle's 5-volume history of the French Revolution, in 1838, he had lent a manuscript of the first volume to his good friend, the philosopher John Stuart Mills. Unfortunately, Mill's servant had thrown the manuscript on the fire, thinking it was scrap paper. And this was Carlyle's only copy. So he had to turn around and begin writing it again from scratch, long before people were making backup copies of things. In 1852, this room was enlarged. The windows were lengthened to let in more light, and the larger room allowed the Carlyles to entertain their increasing circle of friends. In the picture on the right, you can see a fourfold kind of panel here, this screen. This was created by Jane in 1849, and she decorated it with prints of figures, animals, landscapes. I don't know if we can, let me see if I can zoom in so you can see that a little better. Yeah, that kind of gives you a better view of the things that were kind of painted on here. So yeah, she created this, and she wrote, I have been busy off and on for a great many months in pasting a screen. It will be a charming work of art when finished. And indeed, it became one of Thomas's favorite memories of her. And then the chair that you can see in the back of the room here, this chair here, this came with a rotating footstool, and it was given to Carlyle on his 80th birthday, and he would often sit here and read, or he'd doze off by the fire. And it was in this room that he died on the morning of February 5th, 1881. Here's a painting of Carlyle in his chair in the drawing room. Here is Jane's bedroom. Poor Jane did not sleep well. She tried sleeping in several rooms in the house, and she finally settled on this one. It's on the second floor, and Thomas's room was just above it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Jane did not have good health. She suffered from insomnia, severe headaches, respiratory issues, lots of pain. She was treated with morphine, and she often treated her dog Nero as the child she never had, and so Nero would sleep on the bed with her. You can see the curtains on the bed here. In 1849, Jane wrote that her bed had been infested with bugs, which resulted in all my curtains frantically torn down and sent to the dryers, not so much to have the color renewed as to have the bugs boiled to death. And adjacent to her bedroom is the dressing room. The house had no separate bathroom, so the Carlyles used an outdoor toilet, which is still in the garden today, by the way, and still in use by visitors. If you go to the house and you need to use the facilities, that's where they direct you. Jane would wash herself with a jug and a basin and a hip bath with hot water carried up from the basement, and you can see a hip bath here. And if we go back to Virginia Woolf's assessment of the Carlyles and their home, she wrote, both husband and wife had genius. They loved each other. But what can genius and love avail against bugs and tin baths and pumps in the basement? And here is that attic study that I was mentioning. This is the most interesting room in the house. Carlyle spent 12 years writing Frederick the Great here. And at first glance, it looks little different from Dickens' study, right? But the intriguing thing about this one is it was built to be soundproof. Because as I said, Carlyle just could not stand the noise around him. He had this mania for quiet. He found himself easily disturbed. So aside from those, street hawkers and organ grinders, the musicians I was talking about, roosters seemed to have been very popular in Chelsea at this time, and Thomas Carlyle was driven to distraction by their early morning cries. So in the attic, Carlyle put in double walls built at the back and front with air cavities to buffer the sound from the outside. He installed a double glazed skylight with a pair of horizontally sliding sash windows. But despite all this work that he did, the soundproofing didn't work. Carlyle found that situated at the top of the house, he now had to contend with a whole new set of noises, including things like train whistles and boat horns. Remember, they were close to the river. And Jane ended up writing, "The silent room is the noisiest in the house." So poor Thomas. The room is actually very little altered from Carlyle's time. You still have his writing desk. The walls are lined with engravings of German historical figures that he had at the time. So it hasn't changed all that much. And let's go to their garden. They had a typical London garden, not much different from the Dickens home, a narrow rectangular enclosed space enclosed by high brick walls, and it includes that outdoor toilet that I mentioned. Now, Thomas was a very enthusiastic gardener. He grew herbs, flowers, vegetables. He also had cherry, plum, and walnut trees. He had roses and lilac bushes, so he crammed a lot into this little garden. Despite his enthusiasm, Jane doubted her husband's horticultural talents, and she said, "Mr. C does not know a myrtle from a nettle." So she was rather dismissive. But he loved this garden. It gave him a quiet and private place to relax. He liked to sit here in the early mornings or in the evenings. He would smoke his pipe. He'd walk up and down in the garden. And when he couldn't sleep at night, he would come out into the garden and gaze up at the stars. This is a photo that was taken about 20 years after he died. So this is pretty much what the garden probably looked like. Now, 15 years after Carlyle's death, the house and its contents were acquired by a memorial trust. That trust was set up in 1895. The house was given to the National Trust in 1936. It's only open limited hours. It's not open very many hours, but it's well worth a visit on your next trip to London. And here are some pictures of what the garden looks like today. Now, I want to close with the remaining few minutes talking about blue plaques. You've seen in a couple of these slides plaques on the houses that we've been looking at, denoting the fact that famous people lived here. The London Blue Plaque scheme was started in 1866 after being proposed in the House of Commons by William Everett, an MP. He proposed it. The project was taken up by the Society of Arts, later the Royal Society of Arts. The first plaque appeared the following year in Cavendish Square to mark the previous residence of Lord Byron. The scheme is thought to be the oldest of its kind in the world, and across the capital there are close to 1,000 plaques on buildings that are very humble buildings, very grand buildings, and basically they honor the notable men and women who have lived or worked in these buildings. So you can see a few, and different designs have changed over the year. There are different plaques for different societies that kind of fund them. Now, English Heritage has run the scheme in London since 1986. It's not an inexpensive endeavor. Each plaque costs around the equivalent of about $5,500. This includes not only the making of the plaque and the installation, but the research that has to go into finding whether or not the person really did live there. So a lot of research has to go into verifying that someone lived where they said they lived. And in fact, English Heritage employs 2 historians just for this task of finding out if people really lived when they're nominated to have a plaque. So here are some examples, and as I said, the designs changed over the years, depending again who's sponsoring them. There's Virginia Woolf's, Mary Shelley, Bram Stoker. And Oscar Wilde. Now, when Oscar lived in this house, also in Chelsea, he and his family occupied the entire building. Over the years, like most London properties, the building was divided into small flats and sold off. So you can't see his apartment. In fact, during COVID, one of the apartments in this house, he had the whole house, obviously, but one of the apartments that had been split up was going for, oh gosh, I forget, a couple £1,000,000. I don't know if it ever did sell, but I did see a real estate listing for it, I think in 2020 or 2021, going for a lot of money. But unfortunately, we don't have Oscar Wilde's home to visit. Okay, So next week, and not next week, the last week in June, because as I said at the beginning of this, we're having a couple of weeks off because of scheduling issues with Love Living at Home. So June 26th will be our last session in this Historic Houses series. And that will be Wednesday again, June 26th, 2 p.m. as usual. But we're going to be looking at some places that maybe you haven't heard of, including Eltham Palace, Osterley Park, and Strawberry Hill House. So I did want to point out, again, some of those maybe not so well-known places. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to start my video. There we go. And I did see, where did the chat go? I did see a question in chat. Why can't I see it now? Maybe it's here. Chat, here we go. That's a good question, Peter. Peter asks, how and where was Dickens educated? Clearly a notable place to give rise to such writing. I would have to look up a biography of Dickens because honestly, off the top of my head, I don't know. I don't think he had, my understanding is it wasn't that prestigious of an education, but he is obviously a very clever, intelligent man, and he absorbed anything he learned. But honestly, I would have to look into that. As I said, his writing was, his education was interrupted when his father was sent to a debtor's prison, and the whole more or less the whole family moved in with him, or moved in with the father. But he did pick up his education again. He was working as a legal clerk, so he had a decent education. But I would have to find out where he was actually educated. That I'm not sure of. Other questions or comments?
As always, Deb, I feel like you've saved me a trip to London.
You should still take the trip to London. Nothing beats seeing these places in person, but yeah.
How many of the pictures of the photos were your own and how many were stock?
Most of them are my own. I tried, although I must admit this week I was not so good at getting credits in. I try to put credits in when they're not my own. The interior of Dickens' house with the the dining room with the Christmas decorations, those were not mine. That was not mine, because I was not there at Christmas time. But the study, I believe, was, and some of the other rooms were. The garden definitely was mine. The Carlisle ones was a mixed bag. And all of Samuel Johnson's were stock photos. So those I didn't take. For the most part, I try to use my own photos, and when I don't, I try to give credit. But time got away from me for this one, and I didn't get those in there. But you'll notice in other lectures, I try whenever possible. If it says photo credit so-and-so, that means it's not mine. If it doesn't say that, they're mine, then they're mine. But yeah, so it's a mixed bag.
So when are you going again?
I don't know, I want to, probably not the rest of this year, unfortunately, because we're having very, very expensive window replacements done starting in just a couple of weeks. So I'm going to have to, like Thomas Carlyle, I'm going to have to find a quiet corner of the house to do my last lecture in this series. Yeah, our house is literally all windows.
Yeah.
And the house dates to 1958. And with the exception of the dining room, which was renovated before we moved in, it was actually part of a longer side porch, and they turned it into a dining room. With the exception of those windows, which are newer, every window in the house dates to 1958. You can barely open them anymore. You can barely get them shut if you do open them. We cracked one trying to open one in the pantry a few months ago. So we decided to bite the bullet and just replace them all. But it's going to be enormously expensive because it's a lot of windows. So probably not this year. I'd like to get over there in 2025. But I'm not sure for how long, probably not for my extended stay like I often do, because I also have a real hankering to get back on the road, and I really want to go to my other real interest aside from, it's not my academic interest because obviously this is, but I really love Roman history. and Italian history. So I'd like to get to Sicily and southern Italy hopefully next year. We haven't really been doing a lot of traveling since COVID hit, so there are other places on my to see list that I need to get to. So probably I'll go for a week or 10 days maybe, just to catch up on some museum exhibits and grab some more photos. Get some more content for future classes, but probably not as long, not the 5, 6, 7 weeks, because there really are so many other places that I've been lucky. We've gone to a lot of different countries, but there's still places I want to see, and we've kind of lost the last few years. So I want to do some catching up on that. But yeah.
So Deb and Peter, if you're still on, I'm assuming you all keep up with the current events. So what's the gossip about the elections and
Oh
Princess
my.
Kate and the Duke of Westminster's wedding?
Well, the election, I was really wishing we had access to ITV last night because I really wanted to see the debate between Sunak and Starmer. The conventional wisdom is that the conservatives are down for the count, according to the polls. I mean, way, 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 way down for the count. It's gotten complicated because Nigel Farage, who had only about 2 weeks ago said he was not going to stand, he was not going to run for anything. In fact, he wanted to come over and help Trump with his election.
Oh,
He thought
God.
he thought that was more important. But suddenly he had a reversal a couple of days ago and announced that, yes, I'm now I'm going to be the head of the Reform Party and I am running. And so there's a lot of pundits talking, saying that this is going to hurt labor, this is going to hurt the conservatives even more. But at this point, if the polls are to be believed, and as we know, the polls aren't always accurate on these things, but if the polls are to be believed, and I think they're probably right, I don't think the conservatives stand a chance at this point. They've been in office for a very, very long time. People get tired of it after a while. They want a change of some sort. But supposedly, Farage is going to be skimming off some of those conservative votes over to Reform. So that's all I know about that right now. There's a series of more debates coming up. I love the fact that the British do not spend 18 months on their election. It's short, it's sweet. They've got a limited amount of money they can spend. They have a cap on what they can spend. So it'll all be over on July 4th. The election's on July 4th. So yeah, my guess is Labor is going to get in. Starmer's not the most engaging character. People have mixed feelings, but I think the overall assessment is, the conservatives have a lot of problems. And again, they've been in a long time. And after a party's been in a long time, there's always a switch. People they get fatigue and they want to switch. So that's probably what's happening with that. With the Princess of Wales, no one knows anything.
Yeah.
She was supposed to, originally, she was going to be taking part in I forget what it was now, a lead up to the Trooping the Color. But that's not happening. Whether she'll be at Trooping the Color, no one has said, which is in a couple of weeks. As far as we know, nothing has been seen or heard from her since mid-March. As far as we know, she was still undergoing chemotherapy. She was starting chemotherapy, I think, in March. And, that can take, depending on the type of cancer and the type of treatment, anywhere from 2 months to 6 months. So if she's still undergoing treatment, of course, that treatment makes your autoimmune system really crash. So it's not surprising that she would not be doing any public-facing engagements at this time if she's still undergoing treatment, because she would be more susceptible to getting ill. But yeah, there's all kinds of rumors, ridiculous rumors. I mean, I don't know if you saw the portrait of King Charles.
Oh my God. Well,
one of my friends called it King Charles in Hell.
I call it King Charles in Pizza.
Yeah, well, that's a much nicer way of putting it. It's definitely not to everyone's taste, but some guy is now like spouting off. I just read this actually in Italian in an Italian news website, and I didn't even trust my translating it myself. I had to like go into Google Translate and say, did I understand this correctly? Which I did. So this guy on Twitter is now asserting that painting as a sign that Kate is dead. I'm like, oh, for God's sakes. You know, so it's just, I mean, it's just,
Right.
it's whatever. And the Duke of Westminster's wedding, the thing that Betsy is referring to, the Duke of Westminster, is he the Duke now? I guess he's the Duke, or is his father still the Duke? No, I think he's the Duke. He is a good friend of Prince William's and Prince Harry's. In fact, he was a godfather for Harry's son, Archie. I do not know, and none of us will ever know. Supposedly, both Harry and William were invited to the wedding. William's an usher, was an usher at the, I think the wedding's already happened or about to happen. And the scuttlebutt is Harry decided not to come because his brother was going to be an usher, or Harry decided not to come because he didn't want to take attention away from the Duke's wedding. That's all I know about that.
Yeah.
The rumors are just so, you know, people talk like they intimately know these individuals. And I heard somebody recently, a well-known figure, not in royal circles, but a well-known figure was saying, who has worked in journalism and other things, saying whenever you hear a quote that says a close personal friend or a close family friend, don't believe it. Don't believe a word of it. So who knows?
What about the fiance or the wife? Is she a commoner?
She's not, I don't believe she's titled, you know, I saw a picture of her and saw her name. I think
Yeah,
she,
that's
I think
that's
she's,
all I saw. I mean,
yeah,
I
I don't think she's, I don't think,
followed this for a total of a minute and a half.
yeah, she's not a lady so-and-so or, you know, the honorable such and such as far as I know. So yeah, I think she's what we would call a commoner.
Yeah.
uh, as far as I
Cool.
know. Yeah, I haven't really read about it either. I mean, I saw like something in the paper, you know, with a picture of the two of them, and I didn't even read the whole thing, the whole hoo-ha about Harry not coming, because I'm like, oh God, I'm so over all of that right now.
Yeah, I
But,
know.
yeah, it's kind of tiring. But yeah, as far as I know, I think she's a commoner. Yeah.
Well, as always, thank you for
Oh, you're very welcome.
filling me in.
Uh,
Hey, did you see Six when it came to Syracuse?
no, I did not, but I've seen the Broadway.
Oh, you've seen it already.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
very good. It's very good. Did you see it at Syracuse?
No, I saw it in Buffalo in
Okay.
March, and
Okay.
you know I liked it certainly a lot. But my biggest takeaway from that was how sad Catherine Howard's was. I mean, obviously sad. She's young and she gets beheaded, but but the take on it was kind of poignant. And that was my big takeaway from that. I thought it was going to be, you know, girls want to have fun and then cut off your head. But, you
Yeah,
know, it was basically I was used and abused and,
yeah.
you know,
There's a lot. And again, it's very difficult to, it's very tricky. You don't want to extrapolate, you don't want to place our
our
current,
modern mores
yeah.
on, yeah,
But
on,
at the same time, there's now a lot of discussion. Was she groomed? Was she, you know, was she abused by other men prior to her marriage to Henry VIII? So yeah, there's a whole new kind of outlook on all of that now. Unfortunately, she was very young
yeah.
and rather foolish. You know, she she had letters lying around, and she was having an affair. And not that she deserved to have her head chopped off. Of course, she did not. Not at all, not at all. But it was a very different scenario from Anne Boleyn's.
Yeah.
But it was, yeah, it was sad. I mean, any of those things are sad. I mean, look, most of Henry's wives did not have great, great lives with him. I always argued, and there's a historian who disagrees with me on this vehemently, but I always argued Anne of Cleves made out really well. I mean, you know, married to him for 6 months. He wanted to dump her. She says, fine, dump me. He gives
Yeah.
her houses. He calls her the king's sister. She remains at court. You know, she comes to court for different things.
Yeah, she didn't have to nurse him.
No, she didn't do anything.
Yeah,
You
no,
know,
she made
I
out the best of all.
I thought she made out, because even Catherine Parr, who outlived him, you know, that she did not have a great second husband, you know,
Yeah.
and she ends up dying, you know, so right after childbirth. So yeah, I thought Anne of Cleves made out well. historian who disagrees with me said, well, no, but she could never go back to Germany. I'm like, why couldn't she? Who said she couldn't go back to Germany?
Yeah,
But
and besides which, she was alive.
that's right. She lived through it, and she lived with his favor.
Yeah,
You know, she was not
exactly.
thrown out. She was not,
Yeah.
you know, abused in many different ways. So yeah, I thought Anne.
Oh, so
Oh,
have we spoken since Shard Lake was on TV?
I haven't even seen it yet. You know something? It came. Oh
Oh,
shoot, I forgot. You know, I'm glad you mentioned that because I forgot all about it. I had it on my calendar, and it's when we were in Canada.
yeah. Oh, that's right.
For
Yeah.
the-
So you should watch it. It's good. First
okay.
of all, the biggest virtue of all is only 4 episodes. I'm so sick of 8 episodes of things that really don't need 8 episodes
Yeah, yeah,
with all the filler. And it's really interestingly photographed. It takes place, I think, a lot in Hungary and Romania for the
yeah,
monastery, but that's all right.
yeah,
Um, and the acting is great. They have conflated a lot of the characters. You if you remember the book well, which I really didn't. I mean, I remembered it, but
yeah.
so while I was watching it, I knew something was off or different, but I couldn't have told you exactly what. I said, well, wait a second, was that guy supposed to be named that? But it doesn't ruin the story by any
Yeah,
means.
I'm glad you reminded me of that because honestly, that went right out of my head. I was
Oh
thinking
yeah.
about it. I had it on the calendar. We went to Canada, so I couldn't see it there. And yeah, and then I came back and I totally
Yeah.
forgot about it.
You could
The
binge watch it, or at least definitely in 2 days,
Yeah, the
because
author died
yeah,
sadly
I know.
before. He'd been ill. He'd been ill for quite some time. But he
Yeah,
was working on another novel, which didn't another Shard Lake, which never got finished, unfortunately.
maybe somebody will finish it.
Yeah, it's too bad. I really like his writing a lot.
I
I,
do
I
too.
liked that whole series. It was very good. Thanks for the reminder. I will look
Well,
for it.
you're very welcome. So
Okay,
I'll see you in 2 weeks or whatever that is,
you
and
will.
thank
And
you.
yeah, and I'll see you. Are you going to the picnic on Friday?
No, we're
Okay.
going to Connecticut tomorrow.
Okay.
Um,
Okay, we'll have a good trip.
so and we are planning on coming back on Saturday. We may come back on Friday, in which case I'll make it, but it's so doubtful that it's I have sent my regrets, and
Yeah.
so
Okay. All right. Well, have a good trip, and we will also see you.
I'm sorry.
We will also see you at your at your get together. At
oh
your
good. Have you signed up for that? Good.
Yeah. Did I sign up for it? I made note of it. I think I
I
did.
haven't looked at it.
I'll double check. I'll double check.
Yeah,
Anyway,
sign up for it, because I mean, not that I expect to be overwhelmed, but there's only
yeah.
so many people I can fit in the house. So
Okay. All right. Well, have a good trip to Connecticut, and I'll see you somewhere soon.
all right, talk
All
soon
right.
then. Bye,
Bye.
Deb. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye bye.